This is going to be a look at using the Develop module in Adobe Lightroom. I'm going to take a look at the first few panels in the Develop module. The histogram, cropping, basic, tone curve, and the HSL color black and white panels. And I'm also going to build a couple of presets, develop presets that I can use later on. So I've chosen an image here. This is a photo on the road heading to Canyonlands National Park. And just running down the list in the Develop module, you have the histogram as the first panel, and it shows a display of the tone values of the image from left to right, going from shadows to highlights, midtones in the middle, and then your darker areas here and your lighter areas up here. Now this photo is a pretty decent example of trying to expose to the right, not overexposing the image. Nothing is really brighter than absolute white, and nothing is really darker than absolute black. A lower contrast image would simply have more blank areas on either side, or have a slightly different distribution. We also show image camera settings here, ISO, focal length, and then the exposure settings. There are two buttons on the top, show shadow clipping and show highlight clipping. In this case, they're not lit up, and even if I click on them to activate that overlay, nothing shows up because nothing is really underexposed or overexposed. Overexposed areas would turn red, and to show that, I'm just going to drag the entire histogram over until we start seeing some clipping. And those red areas show that it is being pushed into overexposure. It obviously looks quite a bit overexposed as well. I'm going to Command Z to undo that, and then pull the histogram down into underexposure. And there we start to see blue areas for where the shadow clipping is hitting. Undo that. So those overlays can be helpful to see what is really becoming truly overexposed and truly underexposed. I'm going to turn those off right now. And then you'll also notice being able to drag the histogram based on what areas I click on. In the middle, being able to drag the histogram overall, and then in the highlights, whites, shadows, and black areas. I'm going to undo those again. Check my history. I do want to be reset and undo the highlights adjustment that I just did. On the left side here, just as a quick note, have the Lightroom Develop presets, the built-in presets, and then some user presets. The navigator here, which I'm going to turn off for now, and then some zoom settings alongside there. Zoom into one-to-one view, or back to fit, or several zoom presets. History shows all the changes I've made to the image, and I can step back and forth in there. Collections, which is just a way to store images beyond the usual folder structure. I'm going to close that as well. And then I'm going to close snapshots, which is related to history, but I'm not going to look at that right now. Alright, so I've taken a look at the histogram. Now on to cropping the image. If I click on the crop overlay button or press the R key, I can bring up the crop controls. I have crop presets, a square, any number of print paper size presets, some screen presets, and I can build custom presets like a nice 3:1 ratio. I can press the padlock icon to lock or unlock whatever ratio I've set. And I can adjust the angle of the crop in case, for example, if my horizon's not straight. I'm going to undo those crops right now and just try and pull this in. I think this might work pretty nicely as an 8:10, so I'll see how that looks. 8:10 ratio. A little bit tight, but I think I can work with that. I can drag the crop square around the image like that and use the handles to resize it. And depending on where I push this while holding it, I can change it from a vertical to a horizontal or vice versa. And pull that back up a bit and back to the vertical, and about like that. I can also hover the mouse outside of the crop box, click and hold to rotate. And when I do that, a grid appears. And I do want to reset that angle. Now, there are also crop overlays under Tools. Crop Guide Overlay. By default, we see thirds. I can also use a grid. And let's see here. I'm going to press the O key to cycle the crop grid overlay. Rule of thirds, and a few other different presets. And I like using rule of thirds there just as sort of a visual guide for image balance. I can also directly type in angle values or click this button and drag a line to set my horizon. And I think I'll take that slight rotation there. That should work. Now that I'm done with the crop tool, I can click close here or the done button, or press the R key again. I'll head down through basic and just sort of run down the controls here. And the way Lightroom is set up, you want to try to go through this from top to bottom, starting with white balance, down through exposure contrast, and then ending with the presence controls. The image pipeline is designed so that you can go out of order and the results will still be processed in an optimal fashion. But just trying, it's tried, the developers have tried to design it so that it will work in kind of a logical manner from top to bottom. With that in mind, the first thing to adjust is white balance. You have some white balance presets. As shot takes whatever the camera assigned the image, and then some presets from Camera Raw. You can manually drag the temperature slider from cold to warm and the tint slider from a green to a magenta tint. You can also use the eyedropper, click on it, bring it out, and click on a neutral area. The target size can be adjusted simply by scrolling with your mouse wheel or 2 fingers on the scroll pad for a MacBook. A larger size or a smaller size. Larger size is generally better as long as you don't get interference like that, contamination of the white balance area. If you're in a really narrow area where there's not a lot of white, you may need to scale down. But in this case, there's plenty of neutral areas. So I click that. Lightroom adjusts the white balance. And this may be better, this may be worse, it may be more accurate, or you may want to adjust it season to taste kind of thing. I think this will work here, warming up the image a little bit. So I'll leave that for now. Under the tone control, you can press the auto button and Lightroom will try to guess what would look good. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm going to undo that, click back in the history, and then just go through and adjust the exposure. This one's not too far off. I think even just a slight bump increase in exposure will work. And I want to decrease the contrast and pull these edges in toward the center, just to give myself a little bit more leeway with the controls down in the bottom to really fine-tune the tones. So about a -25 will do for this, just to bring those in a little bit closer. Now highlights, which alter this portion of the histogram above the midtones but below the absolute bright values. And the highlights are really handy for bringing back some detail in those bright areas, and we'll see the same thing with shadows in a bit. So I think some negative highlights to bring back some detail in the sky here and in the bright snow. And then shadows, same thing on the lower end of the scale. And I like what it's doing to bring darken down some of those shadow tones in this case. Now whites controls the upper end of the histogram up here. And it's used to push white values to actually hit pure white. And the farther you go, the more becomes pure white. And at this point we see that the histogram, the clipping warnings have lit up. They start out dark when there's no clipping and they get brighter and brighter. So in this case, if I hover the mouse over, I see I've got quite a bit of highlight clipping and a little bit of shadow clipping through these dark areas. So obviously going up this far in the whites is going to be too much. I want to pull that back. I can have some highlight clipping on this. I think that'll work, but I don't want to go overboard on it. I want to make sure I keep detail in the snow. And then the same with blacks on the other end of the scale. And I don't want to go that far either. I'm going to pull that up just a bit. I want to maintain some detail in the dark wood here. So that takes care of the shadows and highlights controls. I'll go down to presence. And clarity is similar to contrast, but it's localized within various parts of the image. I'm going to hide this film strip at the bottom to make this a little bit bigger. Now if I go to negative clarity, it softens the image overall. Negative 100 gets pretty soft, kind of that softening filter over the lens. And sometimes it makes for interesting effects, kind of nice through here in the background. Oftentimes going to maximums either direction is going to be too much. And if you've used previous versions of Lightroom, the clarity filter has been increased in strength quite a bit over what it was before. If you used 30 on previous versions, 15 would give you about the same effect now. So it's often good to be somewhat sparing with how much clarity you use. Now in this image, I kind of like what negative clarity is doing to it, so I'm going to go with negative 30. Now the last two controls have to do with color. Vibrance adjusts colors that aren't already highly saturated. So I'm going to skip that for now and just look at straight saturation, which hits the entire image. And then negative 100 is just a black and white view. Now what vibrance does is it tries to leave those colors alone if they're already saturated. So it's a little bit more control. Or if you go into negative values, you don't quite get to black and white. You maintain some color, for example, through here. So negative vibrance, to some degree, can make for a kind of a soft, almost an antique look. And that's kind of nice on this. I think I'll balance that out with just a bit more saturation. Alright, that's done with basic panel. Now down to the tone curve panel. If you've used curves and levels in Photoshop, you've seen something like this before. The first view here is the parametric curve. You can individually control the various regions of the image curve, from the shadows up to the highlights. And this is really another way of working on the tones of the image in a controlled manner. It's very much a season to taste control. Now you can also switch directly to a point curve, where you can directly manipulate the curve. And this is essentially the same control that you find in Photoshop. We've already got a lot of contrast in this image, but I'll show you just a simple S-curve, which takes the shape of an S, darker shadows and brighter highlights. It's gone too far in this image, but an S-curve can be a good way to give the image a bit of punch and give it some extra contrast. The inverse S does the opposite effect, reduces contrast. And those are two curves you'll use quite a bit if you find yourself using curves, the S and the inverse S. What I'm going to do is reset that back to linear, because I was finding that just the region-based curves along with the adjustments I made in the basic tab are getting the job done. So I'll close tone curve. There is more in tone curve, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. The last piece that I'm going to look at today is the HSL color and black and white panel. HSL, and I'm going to switch to all so I can see all three of those pieces, adjusts the hue, saturation, and luminance for individual colors. For example, in this photo, I may want to increase or decrease saturation on these warm rock tones. I'm going to zoom in on those and then back it off to 1:2 zoom. Now what I like to do is just click on these targeted adjustment tools so I can directly manipulate based on what I'm clicking on in the image. I'm going to look at saturation for the rock tones. I'll click on the TAT and then find, about right there. Now if I drag up, I'll increase saturation. If I drag down while clicking, decrease it. So, of course, I can easily go overboard with that, and I think I will just for fun. Click on Fit again. There's not much blue here. There's a little bit of blue in the sky. If I hold the space bar and click on that, I can zoom directly to it. Hold space bar again, click and drag, and pan around. It's subtle, but I think I can bring out some of the blue sky a little bit more. I'll click and drag up to increase saturation. And then I'm going to look at luminance in the sky. Click on the targeted adjustment tool for luminance. Same area, now drag that down so it comes out. There's not a lot of tonality in the photo here. And if I hit that, I start working on greens and yellows. So it's not really going to work in this case. I'm going to reset all of those tones. 0 that, tab 0, and 0. Enter. If I had some more blue here, then I could really adjust that. But I'm going to leave that alone since in this case it's not exactly working. Back to Fit. Okay. That takes care of HSL. Now before I move on to color and black and white, I want to save a snapshot of this image because I'm going to switch to black and white in a bit. I'll click on to snapshots. It's empty right now, but if I add here and call this color, now I can go back to that state with all these settings, which will be important because I'm going to switch to black and white and then create a black and white snapshot. Color, before I move to black and white, is the same controls that you find under HSL. It's just a different way of looking at it. Where HSL shows all the colors at once, color is you select the reds and then you adjust hue, saturation, luminance. Switch to aqua, hue, saturation, luminance. I like HSL a little bit better because of the targeted adjustment tools, which aren't available under color. But otherwise, you get the same controls. Now, if I click black and white, the image immediately switches to a black and white rendition. I can click Auto, which is already activated, and Lightroom will try to map these tones up and down to try and get what it thinks is a pleasing rendition. But I'm thinking, I don't really want that, so I'm going to zero those out and take a look. Now, I have an idea here that most of my controls are going to be under the reds, oranges, and yellows, and adjusting the blues isn't going to make a huge difference. You might see a bit because there's still some blue in the snow. I think I kind of like that, darkening that down just a bit. A little bit in the reds, and darkening those reds kind of helps there. The oranges we see quite a bit because there's a lot of orange and there's a lot of yellow. So I'll just brighten those up. Darkening the yellow down there creates kind of a cartoon effect. I don't really want that. I'll open the yellows up. Greens, there was a bit of green reflected off the background. I'll darken that down a bit, and I know there's a bit of aqua in that sky, so I'll darken that down as well. A little bit of purple here. Kind of helps add some dimension to the background, so I'll work that in. And magenta, not a lot of magenta in this photo. Alright, so there is one possibility for a black and white mix, and I will save that as a snapshot. So that's a look at the develop module going through histogram basic tone curve and then HSL color black and white. Before I finish this, I do want to build a couple user presets. They might prove to be good starting points for future photos. So I have the snapshots. I'm going to reset everything. My snapshots remain, so I can always go back to those two renditions that I worked on previously, but otherwise all of my adjustments are now zeroed out. And the first preset I want to build is what I'll call the amped preset, which is essentially a lot of clarity. So I'll take a look at that first. Let's see, 50 clarity. Oh, that's quite a bit there. And I'm also going to add 25 contrast, negative 25 highlights, and plus 25 shadows. Now what that does is give the image a bit of a kick, amping it up, if you will. I'm going to leave everything else alone and then go to presets, click the plus button again, and I'll call this amped under user presets. Now what I want to make sure is that I'm only applying the settings that I've adjusted in this panel. So first off, check none. Okay, I had contrast, highlights, and shadows, and clarity, and everything else was left alone. Process version, I'll keep that because I want to make sure that stays, and that's a separate discussion. Create that, and there's the amped preset. So if I reset this image again, click amped, and there's my settings. Reset that again, and now work on my, what I'll call a soft preset. Negative 50 for clarity. Once again, negative 25 for highlights and plus 25 for shadows. And I'm also going to do negative 25 for contrast. Softens the image up. Okay, and under presets again, I'll call this a soft. Let's see here. Contrast, highlights, shadows, that matches. And clarity again. Okay, same settings. Or at least same settings to check. Create that, and now I've got that. So I can switch between those two. And that makes for a good starting point to do further adjustments. And of course I can fine-tune those after I click into that preset. I can also apply user presets directly from the library module. Let's take another photo here. Under Quick Develop, I can click down on the Defaults button and then User Presets and choose one of mine or one of the built-in Lightroom presets. Switch to Loop View. Oh, that's not too bad. And there's another starting point. So that is a look at some of the settings under the Develop module. Hope it's been helpful.